Por favor, roske bote prevlatile menjev kommunista.
In the Russian military's preeminent journal, which is called Military Thought, in 2014, in a seminal article titled Information Operations on the Battlefield. In that article, in 2014, Russian military bragged that if information warfare is going to work, it, quote, must be conducted constantly, in peacetime, in the period of threats, and in wartime. If you're going to use information warfare to confuse, demoralize, divide, distract, and ultimately defeat a rival country, according to the Russians' military doctrine on this subject, you do not just do it in wartime, you have to do it all the time or it doesn't work. When Huffington Post did their dive into how Bernie supporters online got targeted in this Russian attack, they focused in part on a Bernie Sanders Facebook page called Bernie Sanders Lovers, which says it is based in Burlington, Vermont. It is not based in Burlington, Vermont. It's based in Albania. And nobody who's not from Albania appears to have anything to do with that Bernie Sanders site. But the important thing here is that that Bernie Sanders Lovers page, run out of Albania, it's still there, still running, still operating, still churning this stuff out. Now, this is not part of American politics. This is not, partisan warfare between Republicans and Democrats. This is international warfare against our country. And it did not end on Election Day. We are still in it.
Putin learned a bunch of lessons from the collapse of the Soviet Union and the 1990s era. And they largely stemmed from the fact that you can defeat an empire through entirely cognitive, cultural means. You don't have to shoot. If you can get hegemony for your worldview, be it neoliberalism, be it something else, then the people will stop listening to their leaders, and you could have a color revolution. You could have the collapse of the Soviet Union.
When I initially set out to study Trump supporters and the American right sometime in about 2017, I didn't yet know what so-called Russian information warfare was or how it was allegedly influencing what I was observing online. What I was taught, starting with June Cho's Medium series and skimming over a variety of publications by US and NATO military researchers, I came away with the sense that Russia was a kind of powerful, unilateral geopolitical force, and that it was like literally at war with the United States, just not using bombs and missiles and tanks. And so for a while, I believe that this was why Trump was our president and why we'd become so extremely politically divided in America. But let's revisit what I pointed out in part 2 about the role that Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty played in collapsing the USSR by strategically deploying information, sometimes totally real, usually with some kind of bias, and sometimes just like literally fake news, within populations targeted primarily by their ethnic, cultural, and national identities. The Cold War cost the US over $8 trillion over roughly 50 years. And if we think about this $8 trillion as an actual investment in something, and not just as a sort of defensive reaction to the spread of communism all over the world, what exactly was the US investing in? Well, in a word, capitalism. But there's more to it than that. Because while the Cold War was a narrative sold to Americans from the 1940s to like the early 1990s as a purely moral war, wherein evil communist dictators who were just as bad or worse than Hitler had to be stopped by any means necessary, the $8 trillion investment in stopping communism was also like a really literal business investment that was being made into a certain kind of future. US corporate interests were paving the way toward the creation, deregulation, and control of new and existing global markets. We throw the word neoliberalism around a lot these days to just mean generally like free market capitalism and oftentimes something associated with Democrats I don't like, but it was actually like a whole new ideological framework that was meant to usher in a new world based on a new conceptualization of human freedom. In the old world, governments tried to control their people, fight other governments for power, and engage in endless wars rooted in colonialism, imperialism, fascism, and then communism. But the new neoliberal worldview said that we just needed to cut all that shit out and let supply and demand define human individuality and relationships from here forward. This new way of thinking said that people wouldn't any longer need to identify with particular ideologies or nationalism or anything like that, because their pursuit of happiness and freedom would be dictated by the individual choices they made based on simple principles of supply and demand. Neoliberalism was supposed to bring about peace, happiness, and justice for everyone. When Rachel Maddow talks about Russia as a kind of evil global superpower engaged in a relentless and actual war against America, I think she's being honest. In that moment, when she talks like that, her personal identity is wrapped up in US nationalism. She trusts her country's military intelligence community. She knows she's one of the good guys who fearlessly fights the bad guys. And she's doing what she gets paid $7 million a year to do, which is deliver the news to the people. But if the US really did win the Cold War, and if neoliberalism really did become the actual New World Order, then the logic of global markets tells us that Rachel Maddow does a lot more than just deliver news. She operates as a very highly paid employee of a very successful multinational corporation, which seeks to maximize profits for its shareholders by delivering a product to a targeted audience of consumers. And extremely profitable industries fiercely compete for airtime between Maddow's product delivery to maintain advertising space to sell their products to that same consumer market.
Information warfare.
Maddow is therefore an active participant in a set of processes which were the exact intended outcome of the US winning the Cold War. She's just one example of the kind of returns that were made on that $8 trillion investment. In that sense, Maddow's portrayal of Russia as an evil superpower is a dramatic performance paid for by corporate advertisers to reach a consumer market that, based on market research, would enjoy the product being sold to them and would keep coming back for more. Supply and demand. And this is arguably the exact thing that the Russian military did by paying for Facebook ads in 2016 to deliver a product its target set of audiences would enjoy, which would be measured in really precise levels of consumer engagement, like clicks, likes, comments, shares. The mechanisms of consumer market targeting, algorithmic behavioral prediction and control, consumer surveillance, and other increasingly terrifying and creepy elements of our new hyper-normalized social media environment are, in my view, inevitable products of the neoliberal order. These are evolutions of the market logic of mass media, which has just entered into something we called social media. And through the neoliberalization of so much of the world after 1991 and the dissolution of the USSR, especially since the 1990s and early 2000s, which gave rise to a new, unprecedentedly massive global consumer base using a new set of products on something called the internet, it's also no wonder that somebody would start gaming and hacking algorithms within social media to maximize profit for themselves. In the case of Russia, it could be as simple as them hoping to weaken US control over oil markets, such as in Syria, but to me it's also possible that Russia had far less involvement and impact than the US military claims. It could be that a bunch of poor kids throughout former Soviet bloc countries who had become severely impoverished specifically because of the US winning the Cold War were actually doing what the New World Order, neoliberalism, told them to do, to become entrepreneurs, to look for products to sell to consumers on the global market. But with the Russia thing, I think what's most disturbing about it is that we've been talking about it from a position of an ideological lens, which we were all socialized to not actually see as an ideological lens. Here's what I mean. There are ads for Coca-Cola, Nike, iPhones, Prozac, McDonald's, Microsoft, Starbucks, and Walmart on almost every billboard, television, radio, and computer screen in the world. The companies that profit from these ads have more power now than most world governments combined. There's at least 20 years of research on the effects of advertising on human psychology from an individual, societal, and cultural level, and in a phrase, the research says that it really f***s people up. It f***s up kids and their psychological development. It causes disordered eating and self-objectification in women. It causes poor impulse control and hyperactivity amongst kids and teenagers. It makes poor people hate themselves because they can't afford what's being advertised. It makes people more narcissistic and competitive, and the more exposure to this shit people get, the more they support policies that make income inequality worse, which in turn makes any existing social inequalities baked into the culture's economy also worse. So if your culture's got some racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, whatever, the cultural normalization of advertising that preys on people's insecurities and seeks to exploit them for profit ends up oppressing the very people those ads are targeting, no matter how woke the ads appear and no matter how many diversity trainings the employees at those firms are forced to take in order to keep their jobs. And this is what is called, wait for it,
information warfare.
Fake news is a weapon that works by infecting personal identity.
So what I think really happened in 2016 is that some kind of people somewhere in the world, maybe in former Soviet bloc countries, but also maybe somewhere else, it's actually pretty hard to tell, used the existing design frameworks of social media, which were modeled off of corporate mass media, to profit from international markets to make a better life for themselves. They did it using methods that the CIA used to dissolve their own economies, which then opened up multinational markets into their part of the world, which previously weren't allowed there for nearly a century. They jumped into these newer digital markets and hacked the algorithms in a way that's similar to how free trade agreements hacked governments and cultures to basically send messages to different parts of American society that those Americans already believed to be true. While Coca-Cola might sell fake news to consumers by making people believe that they'll be happier if they drink more Coke, Macedonian teens sold both black and white nationalists the fantasy of thinking that if they just kept clicking shit on a screen, they might somehow annihilate their enemy and create a better world for themselves. Whoever commanded the botnets were happy with their investment returns, social media companies were happy with their returns, data mining companies were happy with their returns, and consumers of all these products, such as yourself and myself, who experience nothing but happiness from our addiction to social media, can no longer tell what's real or fake. Fake news is a weapon with that. But the most dangerous thing I think happened through all this is that although this entire global economic framework that the US installed as part of its $8 trillion investment to kill socialism like forever, a basically socialist presidential candidate came extremely close to becoming president of the United States in 2016. And I think while some people, including myself at various times, downplayed any potential role Russia could have played in boosting Bernie's message and mobilizing his base, I actually think it's totally possible. But what I think the former Soviet bloc trolls did is just amplify anything that the target culture would respond to, based on algorithmically tested responses to artificially boosted content.
Today we're going to talk about throwing shit against a wall and analysing what sticks. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
And Bernie was just one cultural phenomena that the target population aligned with enough to continue generating its own message about Bernie and socialism organically to the point where it's now like a kind of movement that's moved beyond markets. And that's not too dissimilar to what the hashtag walkaway campaign was able to accomplish. When we see that Trump did have a small but significant boost in support from Black, Latino, and Asian voters in 2020, despite the liberal assumption that nobody but white people could or would ever support him because he's such a racist, the hashtag walkaway campaign was initially completely fake, but it tapped into something within certain members of minority groups that said, I don't like Democrats, I don't like liberals, and you know what? Identity politics. And so apparently there was a market for that, and there still is. But in the re-emergence of interest in socialist ideas, which are actually able to name the neoliberal moment and ideology that we've all been sort of forced to adopt since the end of the Cold War, there's also been a growing trend to return to class politics strong enough to maybe overcome neoliberal identity politics. And to the dismay of liberals and the wishes of their shareholder masters, much of this vanguard is being led by a totally different kind of hashtag walkaway movement.
Using systemic or structural racism obscures an understanding of what is the institutional mechanism of capitalism.
So many anti-racist leaders of this period, towards the end of their life, were beginning to draw anti-capitalist conclusions, including even Martin Luther King.
Martin Luther King is a Black socialist. He might be familiar with, A. Philip Randolph might be a Black socialist. He's familiar with.
We're dedicated towards building a socialist society from the ground up rather than simply distributing wealth in a way that's broader or requires more servility to the state or to the capitalist class.
Thinking about how anti-communism is not just sort of a geopolitics that comes out of the Cold War, but rather is a mode of governance, right? Meant to preserve and maintain racial capitalism going all the way back to 1917.
Coates's arguments are so shallow in some ways. They don't really do that deeper level analysis. He's pretty decent on race, but it stops there. And there's so much more to the conversation.
And another example comes from my grandma, who was a pediatric nurse who went on strike with the other nurses in her unit. And she said there was no color on the picket line. And this was during Jim Crow.
And that's how I hashtag walked away from liberalism and got turned into a communist by Russian bots. Thanks for watching. Oh my god, I'm so happy to be done with this. Okay, patrons. Zero, Superbone Big Dog, Marina Irini, Roland, TK Jun, Worker Guy, Wupdick, or Wupditch, Will M, Mikkel VL Monk, Sam, Zach, Isabel Abdullali, Katie, Streeter Sweeper, Diane Prado, Brienne, Lauren, Garbage Possum, Space Commune, Ashley Altman, Pablo Ruiz, Ulrich Volker Anderson, Jamie Smith, Labor Kyle, Fiona, Nino Miginishvili, Grosthetics, I don't know how to say that, Jen Garcia, Sahil Shah, Chaotic Capybara, Dirt Knight, Halim Alra, dude, what happened to you? Super Arjuna Butt, Ace, Esmel Fade, Noah, Laura Dale, Bryden Beck, Leo Samalati. That's right, bitches. Singing over Tartar Lamb. You don't even know about Tartar Lamb, do you? This is why you motherfuckers are paying me enough to pay for like my gas bills every month. Posaso, Posaso. Yes. Ivanka Michelle, Ivanka Michelle. Yeah, that's right. One more fancy patron, babies. Fairy tone, fairy tone. Yeah, that's right. Hello, babies. Where I'm living right now, and I can't tell you the address because I can't get doxxed because I'm too much of a fox. It's raining, it's raining, it's raining on our Swiggart's heart. Hey, our Swiggart, I see you out in the crowd. Yeah, when I blink my eyes, every single time, it's because of you. In this neoliberal hellscape, where we can't tell what's real or fake, when we try to cook and we try to bake, all we can do is take our butts and shake. Our Swiggart, our Swiggart, our Swiggart, our Swiggart. Yeah, that's right, Nina. Nina, you're a newer patron, but you're giving me basically 70% of your income, so here's where the good stuff comes in. This is pay to play. This is like the Democratic Party. This is like the Gates Foundation, y'all. You give me all that Patreon money, and I sing and dance for you bitches. No. Nina.